The moment you really sit with the question of how the statue of Zeus at Olympia was built without modern tools is the moment your brain quietly rebels. Because the statue was not small, not symbolic, not abstract. It was massive, towering, God-sized in the most literal way. Ancient sources describe it as nearly 40 feet tall, seated yet still so enormous that if Zeus ever stood up, the roof of the temple would not survive the encounter. And this thing was not carved out of a single block of stone where gravity does half the work for you. It was layered, assembled, balanced, polished, and preserved using materials that actively fight you every step of the way. No electricity, no cranes, no steel reinforcement, no CAD software, no forklifts, just human hands, animal muscle, wood, rope, gravity, and an absurd level of skill that modern people quietly underestimate because it makes us uncomfortable to admit how capable ancient humans really were. This is where the "this should be impossible" moment hits, not as drama, but as a real engineering problem that should not resolve cleanly in your head, yet somehow did. The instinctive modern reaction is to assume there must be a trick, a lost technology, some ancient cheat code we haven't rediscovered yet. But the uncomfortable truth is more impressive and more humbling. The trick was people. Highly trained, obsessively patient, deeply experienced people who spent their entire lives learning how materials behave when you push them to their limits. And at the center of this madness stood one man whose name still echoes through art history like a MIC drop, Phidias. If ancient Greece had a final boss of sculpture, this was him. This was the person trusted not just to depict Zeus, but to embody him in physical form for all of Greece to see. That trust alone should stop you in your tracks. You don't hand someone the task of making the king of the gods unless they have already proven, beyond doubt, that they understand proportion, balance, symbolism, and material behavior at a level bordering on supernatural. Phidias was not working in a vacuum. He was operating at the peak of a culture that worshipped craftsmanship as much as it worshipped gods. Apprentices trained for years just to touch secondary elements. Workshops were ecosystems of specialized labor, not solo artist studios. But even within that world, Phidias stood apart. He had already overseen monumental works in Athens, including the gold and ivory Athena Parthenos, which was itself a technical flex of terrifying proportions. So when Olympia needed a Zeus that would not just decorate a temple but define it, they didn't crowdsource the job. They handed it to one man and said, in effect, make something that proves our God is real. This is the kind of moment the channel History of Questions exists for, asking how humans decided they were capable of things that felt impossibly large. And this is where the materials start sounding fake to modern ears. Gold, yes, but not cast or poured like a statue from a mold. Ivory, yes, actual elephant ivory, carved into living skin tones. And beneath it all, wood, not as an afterthought, not as scaffolding, but as the literal skeleton holding everything together. The statue was not a monolith. It was a composite organism. A living system of materials that expand, contract, age, and react to the environment in wildly different ways. Gold is malleable but heavy. Ivory is beautiful but fragile and sensitive to humidity. Wood is strong but organic, breathing with temperature changes. Combining these without modern adhesives, without climate-controlled workshops, without digital modeling, is not just difficult. It is reckless unless you know exactly what you are doing. This is where the chryselephantine technique enters the chat, and it is not just a fancy word for expensive statue. It is an entire philosophy of construction. Chrysos for gold, elephas for ivory. The technique involved hammering gold into thin sheets, shaping ivory into curved segments that mimicked human flesh, and attaching both to a carefully designed wooden core. Nothing about this allowed for mistakes. You could not just carve more ivory if you messed up. You could not melt gold back down easily once it had been shaped and fitted. Every decision cascaded into the next. This method was a flex because it demanded total mastery. It announced to the world that Greek artisans did not just understand materials individually, but how they interacted as a system. And here's the part that really messes with modern assumptions. The tools were painfully simple. Knives, chisels, abrasives made from sand and stone. Measuring by eye, by hand, by accumulated experience rather than standardized units. Precision existed long before measuring tape because the human body itself was the original measuring instrument. Proportion was internalized, not calculated. The distance from fingertip to elbow. The width of a palm. The way light catches a curved surface. Skill mattered more than speed because speed was irrelevant when the cost of error was catastrophic. You didn't rush when working with ivory. You listened to it. You watched how it responded to pressure. You stopped before it cracked. This kind of craftsmanship is invisible in the final object, but it is everywhere in the process. As the statue grew, another problem emerged that modern builders solve with math apps and structural software: balance. How do you support a multi-ton seated figure without steel beams? The answer is not mystical. It is experimental. The internal wooden framework acted like a rib cage, distributing weight downward into the base rather than outward into the limbs. The seated posture was not just symbolic, it was structurally intelligent. Zeus's throne was not decoration. It was load-bearing architecture disguised as furniture. Every curve reduced stress. Every angle redirected force. This wasn't calculated with equations. It was learned through generations of building ships, temples, and large wooden structures that had to survive storms, earthquakes, and time. And then there's the fact that the statue was assembled inside the Temple of Zeus at Olympia itself. Not transported in one piece. Not assembled elsewhere and moved like a giant IKEA project. It had to be built where it would stand forever. That decision alone reshaped the entire construction process. Scaffolding had to be erected inside the temple, tall enough to reach Zeus's head, stable enough to hold workers and materials, and flexible enough to adjust as the statue took shape. Lifting was done with ropes, pulleys, counterweights, and gravity. Every movement required coordination and trust. One mistake didn't mean a dent, it meant shattered ivory or crushed limbs. This was teamwork elevated to ritual. But building the statue was only half the battle. Keeping it alive was the real challenge. Ivory is not stone. It dries out. It cracks. It reacts violently to changes in humidity. The greatest enemy of Zeus was not time, but moisture, or the lack of it. Ancient caretakers understood this intuitively. They controlled the environment through temple design, airflow, and constant maintenance. Olive oil was not just symbolic, it was functional. The statue was regularly anointed to keep the ivory supple. The temple itself acted as a primitive climate control system, buffering against extremes. This wasn't superstition. It was material science disguised as ritual. When you consider the time and labor involved, the scale becomes almost absurd. Years of work. Dozens, possibly hundreds of skilled laborious. Artisans, carpenters, metalworkers, assistants, cleaners, guards. This was not just a sculpture project. It was an economic event. Only wealthy city-states could afford to tie up resources like this for so long. The statue was as much a display of power as it was devotion. It said, "We can afford this. We can sustain this. Our God deserves nothing less." This is why the story still breaks our brains. Because it refuses to fit the comforting narrative that humans steadily improve, that the past was crude and the present is refined. The statue of Zeus reminds us that intelligence, creativity, and technical mastery are not linear. Ancient humans were not primitive. They were specialized. They were patient. They were trained in ways modern systems no longer prioritize. Skill often mattered more than technology because technology amplifies ability, but it cannot replace understanding. And when you step back far enough, the final thought hits harder than any engineering detail ever could. Humans built gods with their hands. Not as metaphors. Not as myths. But as physical objects that made people feel small, awed, and connected to something greater. Maybe technology didn't make us smarter. Maybe it just made us faster. And maybe the real miracle of the statue of Zeus isn't that it was built without modern tools, but that it was built by humans who believed, with complete confidence, that they were capable of doing the impossible. If humans could build a god with nothing but wood, rope, and patience, then maybe the real mystery isn't what ancient people could do, but what we've forgotten how to do. History isn't just a list of dates and ruins. It's a trail of questions that still don't have easy answers. And that's what we chase here on History of Questions. Not just what happened, but how it was even possible. If this made you stop and think, stay curious, because there are more questions waiting.